challenges we're all facing from climate change. So Chris Skidmore here was a member of Parliament in the UK for 14 years, from 2010 to 2024, including time as a Minister for Energy and Clean Growth. And as a Minister for Energy and Clean Growth, he signed the UK Net Zero Pledge into law. And I believe that was the first major economy to actually make a legal commitment to net zero. So following that, in 2022, he was asked to lead a review into net zero, and that report was published in 23, after which the UK government's actually taken on board a lot of those recommendations. And I think as a company, we're also, personally, I'm really pleased to see the commitment that the UK is making to cultivating meat through the regulatory progress and establishing a framework for delivering cultivated meat, which we're a part of as well. Since then, Chris has also become the chair of the Climate Action Coalition with the former Secretary of State, John Kerry. So Chris, I'll pass over to you.
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction, and I hope you've all enjoyed today's Cultivating Change event. I'm only sorry I wasn't there for the tasting session. I've spoken to several people who have told me they couldn't distinguish between the traditional meat and Meatable's own meat. I was half hoping actually that the pork belly in front of us actually might be Meatable, and they might pull the wool over my eyes, but I'm going to unfortunately have to wait soon until actually that opportunity to taste Meatable's pork. But I think that this has been a great opportunity to bring both innovators and investors together to focus on what I believe is undoubtedly one of the great challenges of our generation. The world's population continues to grow. While estimates are now not as dramatic as once predicted, we are on course for the global population to reach almost 10 billion by 2050. And of course, we all remember those moments when news was announced that the global population had reached 5 billion, 6 billion, now 8 billion people. And perhaps you can recall your own personal thoughts at the time. Perhaps that crossing the billion threshold number seemed momentous, tinged with perhaps an anxious self-reflection on where this might all eventually end. Would such continued exponential growth be possible? How can such a rapidly growing population be fed and watered with the finite resources that we have on this precious earth? Now, you wouldn't be alone. This has been a reflection and anxiety that has preoccupied the minds of some of our greatest scientists and thinkers, even before Thomas Malthus wrote his essay concerning human population. And ever since Malthus, writers and thinkers have sought to raise the alarm over our ability to sustain our global population. Now, with the population about to reach 10 billion by 2050, we face not only the challenge of how to produce enough resources, but also how to, importantly, sustain these resources for the future. In particular, when it comes to meat, we find ourselves in a predicament that we simply will not have enough land, we won't have enough water, potentially not even enough feed to sustain the livestock needed to produce enough meat to feed that population of 10 billion, at the same time as obviously to meet the other competing priorities of human life on Earth. Understanding how to solve these challenges of the future always starts, I believe, with being honest with ourselves about what that challenge entails. Indeed, diagnosis before prognosis is an essential ingredient of all good policy making. So what does a diagnosis of the future of meat look like? To start with, we should start with an important principle, without which success will be unlikely. And that principle is that nothing changes unless humans want to change. Already we have seen the rise of the so-called green lash, where measures taken to improve sustainability, to reduce emissions, to improve energy efficiency are branded as woke in a new front of the culture war. Diet, and in particular meat, have been at the forefront of this war. And so telling people that they cannot eat meat or that they're a worse person for doing so is precisely the wrong way to focus on how to improve our environment. To tell developing and growing nations, many of whom have lived on scarce resources and have worked hard to lift themselves out of poverty through economic development and embracing the fruits of capitalism, to tell them that they cannot enjoy the same opportunities, the same rights, and the same freedoms as their Western neighbours have had, is a recipe doomed to failure. Every human being deserves the right to better nutrition and to protein-rich meals, just as everyone should have the ability to access energy, electricity, or even the internet. These are global goals that sustainability has to deliver, not to ration, nor to restrict the choices and lifestyles of those who have been denied choice or freedom for so long. Indeed, people given choice and freedom at the same time as being presented with informed choices and the ability to understand the consequences of those choices often choose wisely. As individuals or as members of a society, we learn what is in our best interests and we adapt to meet those. We therefore need to maintain, to preserve and to protect a narrative which embraces choice and individual freedom. That narrative also starts with recognizing that meat is highly popular and will continue to be so. There is a growing demand for meat worldwide that is not showing any sign of slowing down. In fact, meat consumption globally has doubled in the past 2 decades, and forecasts predict that demand for livestock protein will rise by 13% before the end of this decade. Many people, particularly younger generations, are taking up plant-based vegan diets, and that's also a welcome individual choice, driven by their own personal determinations and priorities, and indeed individual freedoms. But those priorities cannot be forced upon people. Attempts to talk about how we can replace meat with things like bug protein only benefit one group of people, and that's the journalists who have a field day with such stories. Trust me, as a politician, I know. The choice, therefore, must never be either or. Instead, we need to work with and alongside the hopes and ambitions of all societies and cultures so that we can deliver not just the theoretical prospect of change, but actual real impact that wins over hearts and minds. This isn't about replacing meat, but rather complementing meat. And that is where cultivated meat can provide the opportunity to deliver a both-and approach that does not seek to demonize meat, but rather to allow both traditional and novel meat cultivation to exist in harmony and face a reality together, a reality that is the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations forecast that global meat consumption will increase by 76% by 2050, a statistic that traditional animal farming simply will not be able to deliver in a sustainable way. But let's first turn to that diagnosis I mentioned and the challenges that do need to be met. It is overwhelmingly clear that meat as currently harvested or cultivated amongst living animal populations is a significant cause of greenhouse gases in disproportion to the overall consumption of food globally. Sheep and cattle are responsible for 14.5% of the carbon dioxide emitted into the atmosphere, more than the amounts emitted by the entire global transportation sector. Furthermore, methane emitted from animals is up to 84 times more powerful than CO2 when it comes to global warming, yet methane produced by cows alone during digestion and management accounts for 37% of all human-induced methane. In contrast, research indicates that cultivated meat produced by renewable energy could reduce overall greenhouse gas emissions by up to 92%, lower land use by up to 90% compared to conventional beef production. And this in turn could reduce global greenhouse emissions by up to 3.5 gigatons of CO2 by 2050, and that's coming up for a tenth of our annual greenhouse gas emissions. Livestock are also a dominant factor when it comes to agricultural land use. Meat and dairy provide around 18% of global calories, 37% of protein, yet it uses the vast, vast majority, 83% of all farmland. Without meat and dairy consumption, this is a hypothetical I'm not considering, global farmland use could be reduced by more than 75%, an area equivalent to the US, to China, the European Union, and Australia combined, and we could still feed the world. But it's not just land that is an increasingly scarce resource, it's water too. A common theme of this century will be the competition for fresh water as a commodity, where not enough exists to meet demand. Yet a kilogram of beef requires 15,415 litres of water. A kilogram of sheep meat or lamb, 10,412 litres of water. A kilogram of pork, nearly 6,000 litres of water, and 4,325 litres for a kilogram of chicken. In contrast, compared to traditional meat, cultured meat has the potential not only to use 99% less land, obviously, a petri dish is far smaller than a field, and requires 82 to 96% less water compared to traditional livestock farming. Furthermore, actually the energy requirements for cultured meat production can be significantly lower, 45% less, than for conventional meat production, suggesting yet another potential environmental benefit. Research has shown that this would mean, with a modest uptake, even a modest uptake of cultivated meat by 2050, cultivated meat has the potential to cut demand for global agricultural land by 1/3 and also conserve 225 million cubic meters of water, which is the equivalent annual freshwater use of Cyprus. As demand for meat also rises, intensive farming practices are a breeding ground for disease that are increasingly disrupting global food trade, placing at risk already some of those precious dependencies and supply chains. Particularly in factory farming conditions, pathogens can spread quickly, affecting hundreds of thousands of animals. And in recent years, outbreaks of bird flu or swine fever have led to important shortfalls and higher prices in China and Singapore. Then there's the rising health challenges of the production of meat, the use of antibiotics to reduce the spread of disease and infections. The World Health Organization's raised concerns about the overuse of antibiotics in livestock farming, which can contribute to the emergence of antibiotic resistance bacteria. And yet by the middle of this century, 1.91 million people a year are forecast to die directly from antimicrobial resistance, AMR, up from 1.14 million in 2021. And it's further estimated that AMR will play some role in about 8.2 million deaths by 2050, up from around 4.5 million today. The World Health Organization's recommendation to farmers to discontinue the use of antibiotics in food-producing animals can reduce antibiotic resistance bacteria in these animals by up to 39%. But as we know, commercial production of cultivated meat is expected to be antibiotic-free, potentially reducing foodborne illnesses by minimizing that exposure to enteric pathogens. Then there is, and I think it's really important to reflect upon, the often overlooked aspect of food security. In a rapidly changing world where protecting our environment isn't just a nice thing to have, but it's an essential if we want to protect populations, countries are waking up fast to the fact that they have become dangerously dependent on the global trade for their food, and in particular, the global trade for their meat. China is the country with the highest meat consumption in the world. And that's even taking into account the fact that the annual per capita consumption in China is only 45.2 kilograms per person compared to 124 kilograms in the US. Yet China's demand can by no means be met by its domestic production. And as a result, China's become the largest importer globally of beef and pork. Total meat imports have a trade volume of around $23 billion a year. That's £2 billion a month in meat imports. Malaysia, too, depends on imports for 80% of its beef, with a total value of its meat imports reaching 1.4 billion annually. And as a city-state, Singapore also has to import almost all of its food, including more than 400,000 tons of meat. These countries have already woken up to the challenge, the reality of that rising demand that I've spoken of. And to meet this challenge, they're all turning to cultivated meat. In December 2020, Singapore became, as you're all aware, the first country in the world to grant approval for cultivated meat, namely a product made from chicken cells. Lab-grown meat is now part of the country's goal to produce 30% of its own food by 2030. Singapore now hosts the headquarters of a quarter of all companies worldwide involved in the production of biotech foods such as lab-grown meat or other alternative proteins. And money is also flowing in now from abroad. The Bezos Earth Fund is planning to set up the Bezos Center for Sustainable Protein in Singapore with investments of $30 million. And in his speech to the 2022 National Congress of the Communist Party, China's President Xi Jinping further underscored the importance of self-reliance in food production, declaring that the rice bowls of the Chinese people must firmly be in our own hands. And as a result, the Chinese government's 5-year plan for agriculture also includes cultivated meat produced domestically using biotechnology, while at the same time investing $300 million in an Israeli company specializing in lab-grown meat. Malaysia has also included lab-grown meat in its national biotechnology policy 2.0, while South Korea is currently setting up a special tech park in the east of the country for companies for the biotech food sector. Now, following Asia's lead, now the US and the UK has just been mentioned, and the Netherlands are now all rapidly following suit. All these countries know, as the facts stand, that cultivated meat will help to tackle how we're going to address the challenges of greenhouse gas emissions, water scarcity, global health, and food security that I've all outlined. But to view cultivated meat as just an answer to a problem is, I believe, also framing the argument in the wrong way. And neither does justice to its true future value. We shouldn't just be arguing that cultivated meat will be essential as an alternative if we are to feed 10 million mouths by 2050. This is not only a necessary and urgent solution, but it's also a direct improvement on what we already have. As meat, it brings with none of the disadvantages either to the planet or to your plate. It doesn't have to be pumped with antibiotics. It isn't putting at risk animal welfare. It not only provides the essential proteins, vitamins, and minerals that meat is renowned for, we can even ensure that the parts of the animals that no one wishes to eat aren't produced. Only the finest and choicest cuts, or the finest sausages, need to be cultivated. This isn't just an alternative, this is a bonus that we shouldn't overlook. And cultivated meat promises to also bring huge economic benefits. As I've consistently said when I took net zero legislation through the House of Commons, is when I published my net zero review, the Mission Zero report, new technologies that deliver greater sustainability aren't just good for the planet, they are great for business also. Products that deliver greater productivity, greater efficiency, unsurprisingly deliver greater returns for investors. Recent analysis carried out by the system change company Systemic and supported by the Good Food Institute Europe has found that by 2050, the EU's cultivated meat market could be worth between 20 to 85 billion a year in new and domestic export markets. And the sector could also create up to 90,000 new high-qualified, high-skilled jobs, although the true number could be even higher, as estimates suggest that for every job created, another one will be created elsewhere in the economy. Globally, the cultivated meat market has the potential to reach up to 510 billion euros by 2050. But to unlock this opportunity, clearly we need further action, not just from investors and the private sector, like people around the tables today, but regulatory certainty and confidence from governments. There are several levers to achieve this, ranging from establishing obviously clear regulatory approval pathways to policy support for new R&D funding, the ability to build up infrastructure supply chains for those bioreactors and equipment that will be essential to reach the next stage. As we are in a market, disruptive technologies will not fully break through unless they can compete on cost with conventional products, which will lead them to scale in the mass market. And ultimately, that mass market appeal and lower costs will only be delivered if cultivated meat is what consumers want. High quality, excellent taste, and a product that is better than what they already place in their mouths. This is not a niche product, but a mainstream opportunity to feed future generations and ensure that we can continue to live on this planet sustainably. Acceptance can take time. It always does. Adoption occurs gradually, but then it happens suddenly. I remember when I signed the UK's net zero commitment into law. Then we were the first G7 country to do so. But if you told me 3 years later that 93% of global GDP would have been under a net zero commitment, I simply wouldn't have believed you. We are living in remarkable times where the pace of change is moving beyond what our imagination can envisage. But if the right approach that I've outlined is taken, working with and not against the individual freedoms of people, then there is no reason not to believe that cultured meat will play a major role in all our futures for the better. Thank you very much. Nothing changes unless humans want to change. Every human being deserves the right to better nutrition and to protein-rich meals, just as everyone should have the ability to access energy, electricity, or even the internet. We are living in remarkable times where the pace of change is moving beyond what our imagination can envisage. But if the right approach is taken, working with and not against the individual freedoms of people, then there is no reason not to believe that cultured meat will play a major role in all our futures for the better.